Okay, so welcome everybody. Great to have you here for our next webinar in the series associated with our SWEEP project, Investing in Nature for Health. As with our other webinars, this one will be recorded and afterwards it will be put up on our hub. For any of you that haven't engaged with our project before, this is a part of this wider SWEEP programme looking at applications of environmental research to benefit the environment, the economy and society across the southwest of England, although obviously with wider remit than that geographically too. I'm really happy to be able to introduce my colleague Sarah Bell from the University of Exeter today. Sarah's a lecturer in health geography and has great expertise in a wide range of issues, but particularly recently in the last few years has been specialising in inclusivity in access to nature, particularly thinking about sensory impairment, and has done various research projects along that line and works with a lot of different partner organisations to apply that research out in the real world. So in the usual kind of format, Sarah will be presenting for maybe 20 or 30 minutes. And then after that, we'll take questions. And if you've got questions along the way, please feel free to stick them in the Q&A box. And then we'll have a bit of discussion after Sarah's presentation. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sarah and let you do your presentation. Thanks, Sarah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ben, and thanks for inviting me today. It's really nice to have a chance to talk to you. So as Ben said, I am based at the European Centre for Environment and Human Health. I've spent probably the last 8 to 10 years exploring experiences of health and well-being and otherwise with nature. And I suppose the last 5 years or so thinking about that in the context of sensory impairment. And probably the most notable project that kick-started a lot of that was the Sensing Nature project, which was a 2-year research study funded by the Economic and Social Research Council from 2016 to 18. And it was a qualitative study that was exploring people's experiences of health, well-being and otherwise in collaboration with people with sight impairment. And it was a qualitative study with various phases. I won't go into the details, but do feel free to ask me questions. But since that, I've also been involved in a lot of impact-orientated projects and network projects where I've come across a lot of great work going on around disability access and inclusion. And so I'm going to draw on a mixture of the Sensing Nature research and some of those other projects through today to really highlight how and why we need to think beyond ramps and handrails when we think about disability in nature, and the opportunities that we have to design with and for the senses in doing that. So I will move on to the first slide. So when we think about disability in nature, it's useful to look at some of the large-scale surveys to start with that are done in the UK. And obviously a particularly notable one is the People in Nature survey, which is run by Natural England, and it's the successor to the Monitor of Engagement with the Natural Environment survey that they've run for several years. Now, in the survey that was run last year, it was highlighted that 9 in 10 of adult respondents in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic reported that being in nature makes them very happy. 4 in 10 people said that they were spending more time in nature than they did before the pandemic, with health and well-being being amongst the main reasons for getting outside. But some adults weren't getting outside very often, if at all. 1 in 3 weren't visiting in a 2-week period, and 1 in 5 hadn't visited nature in a month. And amongst others, older people and people with long-term illnesses or conditions were less likely to have visited. And that reflects long-standing trends, not just pandemic trends. But importantly, that doesn't reflect a lack of interest in visiting. So there's an initiative called Ewans Guide, which is a widely respected disabled access review site. And it was established by someone called Ewan MacDonald in 2013, after he was diagnosed with motor neurone disease. Every year they run access reviews across all sorts of different types of settings and places across the UK, not just nature settings. But last year they ran a COVID sentiment survey instead in June, July, to try to understand disabled people's intent and concerns around visiting places in the UK post-lockdown. And this is just a screenshot from the report, but perhaps not surprisingly, given we know how COVID is transmitted, outdoor areas, including nature type settings like beaches and trails, were one of the few types of places where people were likely to go. And that was over and above other health and wellbeing activities, which are further down on that slide. But there remain many different barriers to being able to access those settings, lots of disabling barriers, and not just in terms of physical access, but also sensory, social, intellectual access. And that can be quite frustrating. So one of the participants in my Sensing Nature study, she was in her 40s and she'd experienced the onset of sight impairment over a period of about 20 years. And she said, I think nature has become more important to me in some ways, now that I find it harder to get to it, because it's unnecessary that it's harder to get to. So it feels like it's an unnecessary separation and an unfair separation. It's like it should be more important to get us out into the wilderness because we know that it's beneficial for health and happiness. So it should be more important that we get there, and yet you know that it's not. And that is really frustrating because I know that I'll feel better when I get outside, but it's just difficult to get outside sometimes. So let's think a little bit more about those dimensions of access. And I just want to say a big thank you to the Sensory Trust because they produced these graphics for me as part of an inclusive design guide that we wrote during the Sensing Nature project. So just a big thank you to them. But when we think about access, it's useful to think about these 4 dimensions, and obviously there is overlap between them. And I'm going to take each one in turn through this presentation and give some examples and some background to them. Before I do that, it can be helpful to think through some of these barriers using the access chain. So some of you are probably familiar with this. It was developed by the Sensory Trust to ensure that access plans and reviews relate to all parts of a visitor experience, whether that's to just a local park or if it's to a more of a kind of heritage nature setting with all the visitor centres and everything else. The access chain really recognises that the first step is when people make a decision to visit a setting and all the things that they want to know about it before they go, whether they know that they're going to be catered for and welcomed and able to get about. That's followed by their journey to the site. Can they get there safely, affordably? And then the experience on site. Can they actually get something out of being there? Is it going to be important to them in terms of their priorities and interests? And can they get home safely? And importantly, if any link in that chain is broken, what should be a great visit can turn into a disappointment, or it might not happen at all. So several of the examples I'm going to draw on might reflect different aspects of that chain, so it's just worth bearing it in mind. So thinking about those different dimensions of access, physical access is probably the aspect that people think about most often when they think about disability. So this graphic was developed particularly with sight impairment in mind, and it has the slightly ironic welcome sign at the entrance of the park. It looks like quite a lovely park behind. There's a clear, delineated pathway, there's trees, it's quite open. But just to get into the park, there are cracked paving stones. There are all sorts of obstacles at the entrance, from the bin to the site map, the lamppost with the sign of the dog. Challenging to navigate with a white cane, but also challenging if you are a wheelchair user or if you have a pushchair, mobility scooter. So in this instance, somebody might not even get past the entrance. So when we think about physical access, as a starting point, we often think about proximity. How close to these places do people live? How easily can people get there? Which links to the second point. What's the quality of the surrounding path networks? Can people walk there or wheel there? Is there public transport to get there? Is that affordable? And when they're there, it's not enough just to be physically present in a space. Does the physical fabric of the setting invite exploration and an enriching quality of experience? And so when we think about aspects that contribute to that, we're looking at all sorts of dimensions, the scale and the layout of a setting, orientation and navigation support, the quality of the path networks and how well they weather. A path that might be great at this time of year can turn into complete mayhem through the winter. Are there key facilities, accessible toilets, changing places, seating regularly, all those sorts of things? And there's lots of different guides out there which can help to give tips about how to ensure and embed those aspects of physical access in a setting. But it's worth recognizing that sometimes there is a lack of willingness to change the physical fabric of a setting, especially in historically or ecologically preserved or protected environments. And it's worth thinking about at what point do those protections come into tension with opportunities to maximize their inclusive potential. Now, speaking to this, disability advocate and scholar, Professor Alison Kafer, she makes the important point that in many ways, the reluctance to make adjustments reflects an act of ableist forgetting, a willingness to imprint steps, but not ramps, for example, in a landscape. And I've just got an extended extract from her work that I'm going to share because I think she articulates it so clearly. She writes, "Non-disabled access is made invisible, while disabled access is made hypervisible. Steps are themselves an accommodation, just one made for a different kind of body. Those who protest the development of accessible trails and services consistently use a language of protection in making their claims. In their view, increasing disability access and protecting the environment are irreconcilable. But the fact that it's often only disability access that comes under such interrogation suggests an act of ableist forgetting. As the steps ramps question shows, the development of trails and buildings that suit very particular bodies goes unmarked as access. It's only when atypical bodies are taken into account that the question of access becomes a problem. The rhetoric of eco-protection then seems to be more about discomfort with the artifacts of access, ramps, barrier-free pathways, and the bodies that use them. Trails which are mapped, cut, and maintained by human beings with tools and machinery are seen as natural, but wheelchair-accessible trails are seen as unnatural. Some disability organisations, such as the California-based Whole Access, have countered these assumptions, stressing that whilst all trails affect the land, well-designed trails can both minimise that impact and maximise accessibility for all people. People are less likely to step off boardwalks, for example, and walk through prohibited or protected areas than they are on a trail. Trails that follow the natural contours of the land, as opposed to steeper trails that cut vertically through a slope, tend to reduce erosion, require less maintenance, and increase accessibility because of their more gentle slopes and inclines. That doesn't mean that every single trail will accommodate every single body. There will be terrain too rocky or too steep for some bodies and modalities, but this is true for all bodies, disabled and non-disabled. What shifts in this view is that trails are no longer designed for only one single body, and that decisions about trails are recognised as decisions, ones that can be changed, extended, modified. So I just wanted to share that as food for thought, I suppose, on some of these issues around physical access and ecological protection. So moving on to the next access dimension, sensory access. Now, there's different aspects to this. We can think about it in terms of if somebody can be physically present in a site, can they engage in a rich quality of sensory experiences in situ? And if they can they share their stories in ways that resonate across the senses to be part of the wider story of a site? And before people even visit a site, is there a way of engaging in sensory preparation to try and alleviate anxieties about perhaps unfamiliar or anxiety-inducing senses that they might experience? So thinking first about this quality of experience in situ, the classic example is the sensory garden, and it's an example where it's not always fully thought through, and it came up time and time again in the Sensing Nature project. So whilst efforts to think about people's sensory experiences were really appreciated by Sensing Nature participants, the focus on sensory gardens as an access solution, at least within much more expansive nature settings, which in themselves could be one massive sensory garden with the right adjustments, was often described as a missed opportunity. Sensory gardens tend to privilege quite simple forms of nature contact, whether it's passive touch or hearing or smell, rather than those more expansive, exploratory, multisensory experiences that can nurture a sense of dimension and scale and orientation, that can spark curiosity and support people to move freely and safely in and with nature, thinking about that kinesthetic sense. As one of my participants commented about sensory gardens, she said, people have a go at playing with it, but it very often isn't particularly sensorially rich. You know, people think, oh, you fill it with plants, which have got lots of movement, so that the air moving through them provides lots of sounds and lots of textures and smells and so on. But to some extent, once you've been in it, you've been in it. Just being able to move that I think is most enriching, and being able to move safely. One of the things that I like about the park near here is it's got a number of different types of environments. And I think that's what needs to be considered. So you've got somewhere that is, you know, sort of cool and dark and damp. But you've also got somewhere that's high and light and airy. Somewhere where you can hear water, but also somewhere where you've got really lofty trees. So it's variety, really. And many participants explained how being limited to quite short sensory trails, you know, 500 meters, or small sensory gardens within these much more expansive settings can inadvertently create segregated experiences. It can treat people first and foremost as a person with disability or impairment, rather than people with an interest in nature's varied forms and habitats. And in doing that, it can close down opportunities to explore, to develop new skills, to feel a sense of freedom, or to share nature experiences fully with loved ones. And there are examples out there with a different approach to this. So there's a picture on screen of the Eifel National Park in Germany, and they have the Wild Way Kermit Trail. And that is a 6.2 kilometre accessible trail. And it's not on the edge of the site, it's right at the ecological heart of the site, along the Kermit Ridge. And it encompasses a barrier-free network of paths, boardwalks, panoramic views of the lakeland, and it wends through all sorts of mixed woodland with regular benches and wheelchair-friendly picnic tables. But they also have regular interactive stations that provide information about the park. And that's available in audio, in large raised type signage in German Braille. And there's a tactile guidance system, which means people can actually find the interpretation too. So I can send a link to that if you want to find out more information, but it's just a great example where people have thought about how to make disability a central part of their site and to make sure that people can explore the bits that are most celebrated of a site, not just the edges. Another great example is Potter and Ponder, which some of you might have heard about. And this is set at the National Trust Croom site, which is described as one of the most innovative designed landscapes in Britain. And the Potter and Ponder map, it was co-produced at Croom with 35 children with learning difficulties from local schools. And William Hanekom, and I might have pronounced his surname wrong, but he's an artist from Outside In, and that's an organisation that provides a platform for artists who experience disabling barriers to the art world. And the sensory map, the Potter and Ponder map, reflects moments of sensory joy that the children identified. And teachers who knew the children well worked closely with the children. They used a variety of communication tools and translation methods to ensure that children were clearly making the choice about the sensory moments through tracking eye movements and smiles and gestures and dwell time, for example. And then William, the artist, he created the illustrations to represent those selected moments of joy. And they've been placed on Croom sitemap, as you can see. And it's not just in one small part of the site. These little, they look like bubbles, don't they? But little kind of bubbles of sensory joy are speckled all over that map. And they sort of give cues. So there's, I won't read them all out, but there's one that says, feel the grass between your toes. And there's another that says, touch the leaves in the tree trunks. There's another saying, light and shade, feel the rope, enjoy the light and shade. And the hope is that this type of initiative will encourage people to move beyond that more typical visual landscape engagement and really enable people to unlock those wider multisensory experiences across the site. And again, there's a Makaton key that goes with that map as well. So they've just thought about things slightly differently. And importantly, sensory access, it's not just something to consider whilst in situ. It's important to reflect on the sensory anxieties that people can feel prior to visiting these places, those upstream parts of the access chain, if you like. For some people, the demands or anxieties of taking on board new sensory information can be overwhelming. So recognising this, we're running a really small initiative at the moment with a great organisation down here in Cornwall called Access Lizard Adventure, with Sense and the brilliant Joanna Grace, who's a sensory inclusion specialist who runs the sensory projects. And we're developing a sensory story together to try to promote more sensory access to the potentially unfamiliar sensations of watery landscapes and kayaking amongst people with complex disabilities. So in a sensory story, each sentence of the story is partnered with a rich sensory experience. And sensory stories can be a really useful tool for creating access to all sorts of experiences, nature-based or otherwise. It's something that I think the Sensory Trust are starting to use as well in varied settings. They can provide a chance to almost rehearse the experiences and explore sensations that people might otherwise find challenging before they visit, whilst they're at home in a safe and familiar and secure space. And experiencing the sensory story in that way can help to orientate a person. It can help them to tune into their sensory systems and map out what will happen when they do visit. But it also provides those points of sensory familiarity when they are on site, which can bring moments of comfort. So in our kayaking story, we've got little bits of wetsuits. So we're having the arms and the legs of the wetsuits that people can just put on just to get a sense of what it'll feel like. And little spritzes of water and sand and things like that, just so that people can start to get an idea of what kind of sensations they might experience. So they're less alien, if you like, once they get there. And notably, like all of the stories that we like to read, people don't just want one sensory story. It's nice to have lots of different stories about a site, lots of genres of story. Perhaps some are access stories, but perhaps some are learning stories, or perhaps some are stories that you write together that capture your experiences on site and that make your story part of the wider story of a site altogether. So those are just some examples of sensory access. Now I'm going to move on to intellectual access. And in terms of how I'm talking about it today, I'm talking about how we share the stories and the histories and the ecologies of different sites and nature more broadly in inclusive ways. And obviously this might be more relevant in nature settings where investments are made into interpretation, but it might still be something to think about in other places as well. So partly it's about how you communicate the information according to different people's communication priorities. So you might think about having information available in large print or tactile or audio, in easy read or BSL or Makaton. Perhaps there's a role for sensory stories. As part of a project we've done since the Sensing Nature study called Nature Narratives, we've worked closely with Vocalize, which is a national audio description organisation, to develop some guidance for how to audio describe information when you are in a nature setting. Obviously, it's a bit different to when you're in a museum or a gallery where things are static and predictable. It's all quite changeable in nature, and description might be quite different in different seasons. So the Nature Narratives guidance really tries to give tips to how to approach that. So there's that kind of information. It's also where you put the information. If all of the signage is at head height for somebody who's walking around a site, it's not very helpful for, say, a wheelchair user. It's also about the skills and the awareness of staff and volunteers on site. If somebody with a sight impairment visits, is there a volunteer there who can, sighted guide, who can share the site with them in that way? And importantly, it goes beyond that as well. And I think one of my long-term collaborators, Andy Shipley, who's a sight impaired facilitator and sensory explorer, he captures this really eloquently in this quote. He says, "I think the invitation to all of us is to explore and discover the diverse ways in which sites and habitats behave and express themselves, so we can work with them to reveal and share their unique and distinct stories, to delight and enchant all who encounter them." Now, to really do that in an inclusive way, it's important to bring people whose experiences are seldom heard to the heart of the interpretation process. Indeed, how is anyone supposed to manage or interpret an experience that they're not even aware of, because perhaps they don't tune into the place in that way? Many of us are so preoccupied with the visual, we might not recognize the more subtle changes in temperature or texture or weight or sound or scent, for example, when moving through a site, or how these sensations might unfold differently if you're moving with a wheelchair, a mobility scooter, a long cane or a guide dog, for example. So this is a shift in thinking and practice around nature access that we're currently working on in our impact-focused Restoring Landscape for Social Inclusion project. So the kayaking sensory story is one strand of that, and there's some other strands too, but I'm just going to talk about one other one today. And it's work that we have underway, again with Andy. There's a picture of him there at Sherwood when we were running nature narratives training there a few years back. We haven't yet been able to get to Western Burt because of COVID, but hopefully we will soon. So Western Burt is the partner that we're working with now. And this strand of work is really trying to develop new ways of conveying the diverse sensory experiences and histories of Western Burt Arboretum, including its widely celebrated picturesque qualities, which obviously have a lot of visual connotations, but alongside those visual experiences, there are quite a lot of rich non-visual multisensory things going on. And the aim is really that the project will engage people with sight impairment in the design and delivery of sight interpretation. So we're currently in the process of recruiting 5 visually impaired volunteer guides who are going to be working with us to adapt Western Burt's current volunteer guide training, and we're working with the existing volunteer guide team. And together we'll be co-designing and crafting storied sensing nature and sensing history guided walks that will be delivered by our visually impaired volunteers to give a tour of the auditory and tactile and olfactory sensations of direct relevance to the site's history and story. And the aim of this work really is to try to move away from seeing disability as an access need and instead recognizing it as an opportunity for creativity and shared learning in ways that can open up that physical, sensory, intellectual and social access. And the hope is that through nurturing a more diverse volunteer base, we can perhaps harness the valuable knowledges that people with varied backgrounds and histories and life circumstances and sensory attunements can contribute to landscape management, interpretation and visitor experience. And so in this way, we're trying to shift away from the idea of producing segregated, pre-packaged experiences for visitors with sight impairment or any impairment, and recognizing the knowledge that seldom heard visitors can contribute to these site management, interpretation and visitor experience practices. Really, what's come through in all the projects that I've done is the value in working together to understand and highlight new categories of value and significance and interest across different nature settings. And recognizing that disabled people are not just potential visitors. If the barriers to joining staff and volunteer teams are genuinely dismantled even, working together can create a richer experience for everyone. And now briefly to social access. And I say brief because in many ways, by dismantling some of the physical and the sensory and the intellectual barriers, it is going to help nurture a culture of inclusion across varied embodiments and social identities that in turn will help social access. By celebrating diversity and how sites are managed, interpreted and experienced, it can encourage new perspectives and new people in. I think we're seeing it recently with Kew and obviously the National Trust. There's also a place for acknowledging contested and hidden histories and their impacts on who feels part of a site's story. Obviously today I've spoken primarily around disability and inclusion, but that intersects with all sorts of other social inequalities in who can experience nature and whose priorities and interests are heard and responded to. There's also this importance of being able to support shared experiences and storytelling. So there's a great scholar called Arthur Frank, and he writes, people not only think with stories, far more consequentially, people think with stories. And actually being able to share these stories and understand these stories can foster feelings of belonging and connection. The more we address the ableist or exclusionary norms and practices and designs that permeate the world, whether that's built, socio-natural or otherwise, the more likely it is that embodied diversity can become both common and unremarkable, so that no one feels out of place or hypervisible in being there. So that was a bit of a whistle stop, but really it's just to try and highlight that access reaches far beyond proximity and presence and ramps and handrails, although they are important. That working with the access chain can really help to identify those disabling barriers to access that need dismantling at varied stages of a nature encounter. That there's real value in thinking creatively across those different dimensions of access, whether it's physical, sensory, intellectual, or social. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of collaboration and partnerships. making those unseen or rarely felt qualities of nature experience more compelling across varied backgrounds and histories and life circumstances. So I will stop there, but thanks ever so much for listening.
Fabulous. Thanks very much, Sarah. So please do, if you've got questions for Sarah, post them in the Q&A box. Really fascinating stuff there, Sarah. And we've already had one question in the chat. Somebody was asking if you could post a link to that, the German example that you were talking about.
Yes, I can.
So if you can find that and stick it in the chat at some point,
absolutely.
that would be great. But I'm going to take chair's prerogative to ask you a question first.
Okay, I'm posting a link.
Yeah, go for it. I was really fascinated by your discussion about this kind of potential conflict between conservation and environmental protection and providing infrastructure that supports and promotes accessibility in all sorts of ways. And I think that's an argument that's been had a lot in lots of different kind of outdoor environment kind of contexts about sanitizing the environment and all that kind of stuff. But I thought it was really interesting. You were basically saying the environment is already full of tons of access infrastructure. It's got steps in it, it's got stiles, it's got paths and car parks and stuff. So I wonder in your sort of work and your work with sort of participants, but also with organizations, how those kind of conflicts, trade-offs kind of are thought about, and it's clearly kind of pretty messy.
Yeah, really messy. And it's, I think the first thing that I'd want to say is that participants often agree that they don't want handrails going up mountains, or that they recognize that there are places that are too ecologically sensitive to put heavy infrastructure in. But I think it's wanting that recognition that accommodations are already made for a huge number of people that are just not recognized as accommodations, rather than immediately batting back by saying, no, we can't do that because it will damage the environment. But I think also it's, there's some places where perhaps you can change the physical fabric of a setting to promote access. But in some cases, it's having professionals with the expertise and the time and the open-mindedness to actually help different people build the skills that they need to be able to access those environments using equipment or whatever it might be, without necessarily having to put handrails up mountains. So I remember one person talking about Vision of Adventure, which is a great organisation based up in Cumbria. And this person, he was sight impaired. He does caving and climbing and kayaking and going into all sorts of terrains that I would be absolutely terrified to go to. But it's because he'd spent years with Vision of Adventure learning the skills to do that with their support, with the right equipment. And so he was able to access environments that are ecologically sensitive, that people can only access with a very specific skill set. But because people had taken the time to adapt their training to people's different needs. So I think there is that balance of, what can be done in a site and what can be done to build the skill sets of people that are involved in promoting access to a site, and to do that in collaboration with different people. So yeah, it's a really messy issue, but I think it's just having people willing to have some of those conversations, rather than immediately just saying, no, it's too ecologically sensitive, it's too historically important, or it's too expensive. And I think it's just recognizing that there are nuances there.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Sarah. And yeah, Beth asked a follow-on question, but basically you've already answered it, so that's great. Okay. 2 questions in one. Another question is, can you recommend scholarship on co-designing with these communities specifically?
Oh gosh, that's a good one. I know there's top of my head, I know so Open Space in Edinburgh have obviously done a huge amount of great stuff, particularly around urban green space. And there isn't a huge amount of genuine co-design, I wouldn't say. I think there's a lot of bringing people in for a taster day and then doing a focus group or that kind of thing. But I from my experience, I haven't come across a huge amount of genuine co-design work. So I think there is a need for that. And obviously that requires funders to be willing to put in the investment that needs to come with that, in terms of time and flexibility, funding the costs of personal assistance to be part of these conversations as well, and all that sort of thing. So I think it's definitely needed.
Yeah, I mean, my guess is, do you think there's presumably there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from co-design of other kinds of support and services and so on, that may not be related exactly to this topic, but probably have lessons to be learned?
Yeah, definitely. And definitely in terms of how to do it. I think there's some great work, not specifically around nature, but Professor Brett Smith up in Durham has done some brilliant work around co-designing physical activity guidelines around disability, and trying to move beyond some of those blunt guides to go and be active for this long in this place for this amount of time. And that's been a really, really sensitively navigated co-design process. So although it's not just about nature settings, there's certainly a lot we can learn from that. Oh yeah, and Dementia Adventure, go, I just spotted that in the chat. That's a very good example.
Great. Another question here from Anonymous. So how do we help land managers and so on develop the skills needed to integrate some of the nuances of accessibility into the places they look after?
Yeah, so that's something that we've, a lot of the training that we've been running over the last few years has been around different aspects of that, whether it's inclusive design or audio description or sighted guiding and stuff. And we're doing it on a site-by-site basis when you can get funding for it. But essentially, it is about being able to fund these training skills. So you have experts going in who can spend some time on the site, which gives people involved in site management and interpretation permission to spend some time thinking about this, to learn these skills, and to think about that in the context of their specific locations. Again, the Sensory Trust has done a huge amount of this sort of thing as well. But I think it's difficult because it's often on a site-by-site level, and it's quite hard to actually get that integrated at the top level. So it's rolled out across all settings that an organisation manages or is involved in. There is a project that's just starting with Dr. Claire Hickman in Newcastle called In All Footsteps, and that's looking at public rights of way and access and histories of access and disability inclusion from that perspective. And I think that will get into a lot of the issues around landowners and awareness and access and inclusion from that perspective. But yes.
Great, thanks. And I guess kind of related to that, really, this question from Sammy, and I guess this is something you're doing already in your projects, but have you got links to good trainers or networks of trainers, I guess, who can provide this kind of training for volunteers?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, the Sensory Trust is a great place to start. They're fantastic. They're great to work with. So I've worked closely with a brilliant trainer called Zoe Partington. There's Andy Shipley, who I've worked with a lot, and they will train on different aspects of this depending on what specific type of access you're interested in. Joanna Grace is brilliant if you want training in sensory stories and that side of it. So you can certainly email me and I can send you links to different people, but there are people doing really good stuff in this area. Vocalize if you want audio description type training. Yeah, so there are good people.
Thanks, Sarah. And I think you've probably got links to some of these folks from the Sensing Nature website, so we can post that in the chat.
Yes, definitely. Oh yeah, I can put that in there.
Yeah, great. This is a tough question and an interesting one. How do we make arguments for greater investment in the face of likely austerity due to COVID, but also possibly greater need?
Well, I mean, 15% of the global population is disabled. So we're not looking at a small number of people here. And I think if the UK invested in it and could demonstrate how to do it well, they could be a really good example which other people can learn from. I know there's obviously major financial issues in the country now, but if the UK can't invest in this, then what hope is there for some other countries? We're also an aging population, so more and more people are going to be experiencing some kind of impairment, and these types of barriers are going to become relevant to more and more people. So it is expensive, but it's not for a small subset of people. And often the adjustments that you make, say for a wheelchair user, are also beneficial for people who have pushchairs. Investments that you make to try and make things easier from a cognitive processing perspective also just help everyone who's really tired and knackered and actually does just need a little bit more time to process things. So I think it's trying to move away from seeing it as a thing that has to be done to actually something that is beneficial for a huge number of people. And there's the purple pound as well. So it's not, I was speaking to somebody a few weeks back and they were saying, oh, we want to do all of this on our setting, but we can't really just do charitable things. And it's like, it doesn't have to be a charitable thing. People have money, and often, so some of the people that I spoke to in Sensing Nature, they were saying, even we don't have a lot of money, but the money we have, we'd actually quite like to spend in these types of places, but we can't because we can't get there, or we can't actually benefit from being on site. So I think it's trying to tackle some of the assumptions we make when we think that it's not a sensible investment. Yeah, sorry, that was a long answer.
Another question here is, have you compared differences between different types of environments in terms of the barriers to access and the complexity of dismantling them?
Yeah, so my research is it's all in-depth and qualitative, so I haven't done it at a large population level. And I think it's a tricky one because it also depends on people's individual biographies and the support networks that they have and what they bring to a site as well as what's on a site. But obviously, there are certain environments where it is easier to tackle some of these physical barriers, certainly. I think urban parks, certain kind of woodland environments, they're obviously going to be slightly easier to tackle there than they are when you're in the more remote mountainous type areas or the more off-grid areas. But I think it's just, yeah, I don't know how easy it would be to do a comparison by environment type, given you're talking about people with a really heterogeneous group of people. Even within the group of people I spoke to with sight impairment, there was so much variation depending on their life circumstances, their histories, the environments they live in. So if you then move that out across all sorts of different impairments and backgrounds and places and histories, it becomes quite difficult to slot it neatly into those typologies. But yeah.
No, that makes sense, thanks. Question here from Simon, and you may not know this specific example, but you might be able to generalise. About what's the difference between the German trail site and the Howden Forest trails in Exeter? Howden Forest has accessible trails and fun activities, like the Gruffalo story-based ones. What is it that's exemplary about the German site that you don't see often in other places, I guess?
I haven't been to the Exeter site. I think what just really surprised me about the German example, and I just use that as one example because it's one that I think people don't often know about, it's the fact that for a start, the accessible activities were not just the family child-oriented ones, which I think often sites are very good at trying to cater for inclusive family experiences, but they're not necessarily always great at thinking about that across the whole different range of backgrounds that people might come from. But also, I think just because they had thought about all those subtleties, the fact they hadn't just put Braille in and thought, right, now sight impaired people can visit. They'd actually put in a tactile guidance trail for people to get around the site to be able to find the interpretation. They'd recognise that only a very small number of sight impaired people necessarily use Braille, so they'd put audio in. They thought about that rich diversity of habitats, which maybe the Howden Forest example has as well. So I'm definitely not saying it's the best, it's just one example of a place doing it well. And it's just, the more examples we can have of places that are doing this well, the better, but it's just trying to move beyond those slightly token approaches to it and thinking about it a bit differently, I think.
Yeah, and it seems to me those examples of those case studies of best practice and so on are always really useful to just get a reality of what can this look like.
Definitely. And similarly, Westonbirt are doing great things as well. I mean, I think one of the major challenges that they have is being such a rural site. So just that process of getting there is quite difficult. But they've got their treetop canopy walkway, which is all wheelchair accessible and things like that. So there are good examples in the UK as well.
Yeah, great. Interesting question from Sammy. How do you find the current funding availability for this work?
Challenging. So obviously I'm coming at it from a research perspective. I think the Heritage Lottery Fund, if that's still what they're called, and Big Lottery have funded some great projects in the past, and I think continue to do so. But I think it's quite difficult to get the smaller pots of funding, where if you just want to, say, train all of the staff across all of the wildfowl and wetland trust sites, for example, in sighted guiding and audio description, I think it's difficult to get that sort of funding, because you're not necessarily doing anything innovative. It's not necessarily a project, and yet a whole staff base having those skills would be amazing. But it seems that trying to secure funding for that kind of thing is much harder. So the projects that I've been doing has been internal, ESRC funding administered internally through Exeter, where we've been able to develop funding for developing new forms of training that didn't exist before, and piloting and trialing them with different sites. But we wouldn't get funding just to roll out training that already existed across loads of places, because there's nothing developmental in it. So I think that's a challenge, that trying to get funders to see that type of training is really important as well. It doesn't always have to be new and innovative. It's just rolling out something that we have that we need.
Yeah, funders do like funding new and innovative things, which is great.
Yeah.
Need the money to get on with it as well. It's really true. So great question from Natasha. The access chain and levels of access is a really useful checklist to consider for designing green prescriptions. Have you got any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so the green prescriptions has come up a bit, and obviously I'm not the main person who's working on that, definitely at the centre, but I think the green prescriptions brings together a little bit of what I was talking about before, having people and professionals with the right skills to be able to understand and tailor those prescriptions to the needs and the backgrounds and the priorities of the people they work with. And part of that process will be thinking about, well, what sites can we use and how and when? Is this a place that we can use in the winter, or is it just a summer place? We've done a little bit about that in terms of blue prescription, and thinking about that blue care skill set and how to support professionals in complementing all the skills that they have in terms of, kayaking instruction or co-steering instruction, with actually, how do you read a situation? How can you understand people's potentially sensory and social anxieties and support them in a comfortable environment to then make the most out of that prescription? So it's the access chain is definitely an important part of that, but I think there's probably a bit more to it as well.
Yeah, great, thanks. Okay, well, we're getting close to drawing to a close, but before we wrap up, I guess this is quite a good question to end on. It's probably a really difficult one. What's the first or key thing that a land manager could do to improve a place for people with different abilities?
I would say invite them and listen to them and see what it is that they are finding difficult about the site, but also what is it about the site what do they tune into? Why would they come to the site? What is it about the site that is important to them, and how can those qualities of experience be opened up better? And to keep listening as well. Just because you've spoken to one person with sight impairment or one wheelchair user, it doesn't mean that you're going to understand the experiences of all people with sight impairment or all wheelchair users, in the same way that if you spoke to me, you wouldn't then understand the needs and experiences of all women. So I think it's I would say a first step is just reaching out to your local organisations of people that you would like to engage, and just invite them for a visit. And you might find that very first bit of the access chain already falls apart. Certainly with Westonbirt, recruiting visually impaired volunteers, the first thing that has come up is it's a really inaccessible environment in terms of public transport. So yeah, I think just being willing to listen and to start to think about how you can address things in a collaborative way is probably a good place to start. And I mean, a step before that, I would just say go to the Sensory Trust website and have a look at all the resources they produce, because it's brilliant. But Yeah.
Some very useful top tips for getting stuck into it. Thanks very much, Sarah. So thanks for a fascinating presentation, great discussion, loads of really good questions. Thanks everybody, really excellent. And like Sarah says, follow up with her Sensing Nature website, with the Sensory Trust website, lots of other resources that are out there. So just to wrap up, I'm sticking a link in the chat to our sweep project. So as I said at the start, this project, Investing in Nature for Health, is a part of the Southwest Partnership for Environment and Economic Prosperity, a whole range of projects across the Southwest, developing societal and environmental impact from environmental evidence. So check out the SWEEP website for a real sort of diversity of research and activities on this area across the Southwest, but with relevance across the UK and elsewhere as well, obviously. But do check out our Investing in Nature for Health hub specifically. If you want to sign up for that, that's where we're posting all the resources arising from the project. We've got various things that are posted on there already, and that's where all the recordings of these webinars will end up as well. So if you're interested to follow up afterwards, the recording from this webinar will be posted on the hub at some point before too long. So keep in touch with us, drop us a line if you're interested in these kinds of issues, and we can keep you up to date. But I'll just wrap up there and say thanks very much to Sarah, and also to my colleague Shanda Bell, who has done all the hard work in the background getting this all together. So thanks very much, everybody. Enjoy your Friday afternoons, stay safe, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thanks, everybody.